Hello everyone, welcome to the Kines 293 lecture. Today we're going to begin our last module, and it's an abbreviated but nevertheless important module, and that is on the social geography of space. And throughout these last couple of lectures, we're going to be guided by this idea presented by Lefebvre and taken up by other geographers, and that's the idea that social space is a social product. We often have this belief that space, whether in the physical or in the abstract, like physical spaces, are just these neutral containers in which all of human activity just takes place and transpires without any ideological structure or historical, political, social implications. However, that's not true. Physical spaces are not these kind of neutral, apolitical, ahistorical things that have no influence over human thought and human behavior. That means that power matters within spaces, history matters within spaces, and it influences how we understand those spaces and act within certain spaces. Therefore, spaces, how they're imagined by people, and as a result, how people act within them, are a product of power, are a product of how those certain spaces are structured. But to take a dialectical view, as we have throughout this course, it's not just that society produces space, but also those spaces that are structured by power also, on the other hand, produce society as well. And so we're not going to get too far into this argument, but we're kind of going to use that framework in its limited presentation. But today we're going to talk about space in terms of the growth of the city. And we're going to argue that the city was a precondition for and the product of industrialization. And then we're going to talk about how that matters in terms of sport and physical culture. And we say that the urban context in cities was a product of industrialization for a number of reasons that we'll get into in this lecture. Among them being the fact that it brought producers together, it brought consumers together, and it was responsible in many ways for the growth of industrial capitalism. And just some context about the evolution of cities before we go forward. Geographers, Rees in this case, point to three different phases of cities. So in the early 1800s, he identifies what's called the walking city. And these are not really how we understand cities yet. They're small and commercial. The land is not specialized yet. There's a lot of open space. It's quiet. You walk everywhere. It's not this kind of industrial hub. However, once we get to the 1860s, 1870s, and for the next about century after that, we get the rise of how we kind of understand cities today, where factories go up and businesses go up, and we see property value go up as a result, and we see zones and spaces with these highly specialized use, specifically used for the accumulation of capital. And then post World War II, we kind of get a change in how we understand these industrial cities brought about by suburbanization, in which the cities that exist, the people that live there and work there, start to move outside of the city as a result of government intervention and these specific programs that incentivized people, certain people, to move from the city, and on the flip side, kept people, certain people, in the city. And we'll talk about that later. And we're going to argue that urbanization, through all these different, separate, but intricate processes, was a prerequisite for the development of the sport industry. And so this is our guiding question throughout this lecture. What is the relationship between sport and physical culture and urban cities? Well, we're going to argue dialectically. We're going to say that cities produce sport as we know it today, but also that sport in many ways produce cities as we know them today. So we'll start with the first installment of that argument and talk about how cities in many ways produce modern day sport. So the development of physical culture and as a result physical cultural spaces relied upon urbanization in order to come together as we know it today. And one of the things it did was bring together these three critical elements for the development of sport, and that is participants, spectators, and producers. And all three of these elements are necessary for sports to come together, but they're also kind of this virtuous cycle that they feed into each other, they rely upon each other, and through sport, they all get a synergy from the capital involved in sport. So let's go through these one by one. Participants. Well, as we know, urbanization brought a lot of participants together. It brought a lot of people into cities living in close proximity, working together, going out together after work, becoming friends, all within this close density. And for sporting purposes, that's good because, as we know, the phrase iron sharpens iron, which in the sporting context, that means that the best athletes are playing against the best athletes. And as a result, they get better. It's easier to identify who's the best. And the more that they play each other and practice each other and are around each other, the better that they get at sport. As a result, we get sport in general via the performances becoming a more profitable endeavor for the people with capitalist interests in it. So, participants all together in the city very much help sports. But that doesn't matter for growing sport unless you have spectators, which, as we know, are people like us. They're the consumers that are needed to consume sport. Sport, of course, would not develop unless there were people willing to watch it, willing to keep up with it, promote it, things like that. So, why do spectators want sport? What's in it for them? Well, a lot of people were former participants, so they have an interest in it. But also, sport spectatorship, a lot of people were just fans. It allowed immigrants to celebrate their identities in an American way, like we see here the Fighting Irish. We all know about the controversy around Native American mascots. Those were not necessarily um, in the will of those tribes, but still, there's a lot of these different mascots and different teams that have these connections to these ethnic communities. And whether it was an ethnic community or just a regional community, as we know, sports teams were used to help people identify with their locality and create a sense of pride in where they lived. So we have participants, we have athletes all together to make this sport. We have people willing to watch the sport and keep up with it. Now the last ingredient that we need for sport to flourish is the producers. We need people to organize it, to create these organizations that would allow all these participants to play in this uniform and structured way and meet the consumers of sport with them. You also need people with media to promote it and entrepreneurs willing to invest capital to make things such as stadiums and equipment and things like that. As we've talked about previously, like I said, the media played a big role as one of these producers as sport, as they had a symbiotic relationship with sport, as sport was a popular source of content for media, and media, of course, helped sport to promote itself to build an audience of spectators. And both made money off of these advertising sales. We've talked also before about entrepreneurs with the enclosure movement, these people willing to build stadiums in order to have a place for these participants to play and the consumers to watch them. And also, we get this influx in cities of sport growing as kind of this working class activity. And a lot of this was because of the advent of transportation, specifically mass transit, that was based on, or rather based near working class communities, allowing working class people to not only identify with certain teams that were near them that they had access to, but form a sense of pride with those teams as well. This is kind of the story of the Chicago White Sox. The stadium was built right along the transit, and a lot of people from working class communities would get off work, hop on the L train, which is Chicago's transit, and go straight to the game and back. So it was made for this easy access to the game, to sport. And so that's how we see City in a lot of ways, bringing together participants, spectators, producers, transportation, providing the necessary ingredients for sport as we know it today. But the inverse is also true. Sport, in a lot of ways, helped the city. It wasn't just that the city was giving sport everything they needed. Sport also played a role in helping cities. And one of the main ways that sport helps cities, not only historically, but today, is image. Sport allowed cities something to brag about, something to kind of put them on the map, something to increase tourism, bring urban development, bring people. Oftentimes, sporting teams were used as kind of a memonym for these certain cities, or something to stand in place to create an image of a certain city for people that never have been there. A great example of that is the Green Bay Packers. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Green Bay, but I lived a couple hours away from it for a while, and I'll be the first one to tell you, Green Bay is really trash. It's a really bad city. There's not much to do. There's Lambeau Field and a couple bars around it, and the rest looks like it got nuked. But nonetheless, it's one of the most popular franchises in the entire world. Everybody across the world knows about Green Bay. Well, if you care about football, which isn't that many people. But Green Bay, let's just say nationally, everyone's heard of Green Bay. And as a result, people have a heightened image of Green Bay over many cities that don't have an NFL team or sports teams in general. For example, Montgomery, Alabama has way more people than Green Bay and is much more of a thriving metropolis than Green Bay. But since they don't have any sports teams, people don't know about that. So in this case, we can see kind of Green Bay or the Packers or Green Bay, I'm sorry, using the Packers as a way to create this image for them that without sport they wouldn't have, and as a result would probably be even worse off than they already are. If anyone ever goes to Green Bay, I'm sorry if I ruined it for you. Please enjoy it. Maybe you'll see something in it that I don't. So we can see that major cities use sport as these status symbols, and sport had an important role in this. It would bring people, it would bring businessmen, and it would bring politicians, and have positive impacts on politics, on the economics of it, because of people wanting to be involved with a certain city's sport. And also, because sport had such an impact in certain places, we see infrastructure start to go up to support sport in urban places that without sport probably wouldn't have gone up, but nonetheless have had positive impacts for people whether they cared about sport or not. Things such as parks and playgrounds and gym created all these spaces for the infrastructure of sport to train these athletes, but also had the benefit of the general public being able to use them. But you also need a place for this mass sport, this elite sport to flourish. And so within the walking city, early cities, this happens kind of anywhere. Remember, there was a lot of open space and a lot of vacancies that people would just play sport in. But as cities developed, we start to see stadiums and clubs locating to all these different places that are sources of capital for the people building there. And where these stadiums and where these physical cultural spaces were built were very much a product of business interests. It was negotiations between private capital owners and the city that a lot of times would benefit each, sometimes more, sometimes one party more than others, but nonetheless was something that a lot of consumers and even the athletes themselves were left out of. We see Brooklyn's Ebbets Field, the classic field built in 1913, near an underused trolley line that was owned by the team investors as a way to not only, um, of course, build a stadium for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but get people to use that trolley line in order to make their investors rich. We also see Fenway Park constructed near this undesirable plot of real estate. There was just this space within Boston that the city didn't know what to do with, and so they decided to build a ballpark there for the Red Sox. And the space, though, wasn't necessarily big enough to fit the standard outfield that we saw in other places. So instead, they made a really short outfield and just built a huge wall in order to offset that. They had to work around this space in order to make people money and get rid of this undesirable spot within the city. Thus, the Green Monster is born. As this is happening, though, as cities are urbanizing and people are coming together for various things and playing sport, there's a lot of public concern, as there always is, over this movement, particularly its implications for the general health and general morality. And as they start to build, a lot of people view cities as the centers of disease due to all these people, mostly of different backgrounds, coming together for the first time and carrying all these different um, regional habits and cultures and all these different things. They saw it as a recipe for disease and vice, specifically of a lot of unsupervised young men. Now, this was, of course, in part racism, xenophobia, just anxiety over people living near someone they're not used to for the first time. But nonetheless, there was disease that propped up in cities as they started to develop, just due to a lot of people living together and not always the most clean conditions. And so, in order to shape this health and morality, changing and structuring urban spaces in order to alleviate these problems became one of the efforts of social reformers. And they saw structuring these urban spaces as a way to alleviate a lot of the problems that people saw as specific to the city, among them being crime and delinquency, bad and unhygienic health practices, congestion, disease, and overall hurting of the social fabric, which means no longer that small town unity, but people coming together in cities for the first time. Something that we still kind of hear today, that people aren't as nice, people aren't as connected, people aren't as blah, 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 whatever in cities as they are in the small town. I don't think it's true, but maybe I'm wrong. But nonetheless, this was a big concern about cities, and they saw structuring urban spaces as a way to alleviate these issues. And so that's what they tried to do. They tried to create a lot of open space in which they could promote health and promote a quote unquote proper morality. And in these spaces that they built, it wasn't just build it and people will be able to be healthier, but they had specific goals for these spaces, among them being to educate residents certain quote unquote moral lessons and alternatives to going to bars and the immorality that we talked about in the last module, but also to assimilate immigrants into quote unquote American culture, a way to kind of take all these people coming from Ellis Island and coming from these European cities that a lot of people didn't accept, and get them to shed their ethnic background and ethnic cultures in order to become quote unquote American, whatever that means, right? And this was the goal of the settlement houses. They were popping up in cities all over in the early 1900s, and kind of the Hull House in Chicago by Jane Addams was one of the most notable ones. And what they did was they took these urban poor and these kind of ethnic immigrants who there's a lot of overlap with the poor there, and they would take them in and offer them a lot of educational and social services. Now, of course, they did a lot of good things. They would provide food and education and training and a lot of things, but they were often led by these middle and upper class women who provided an education for them focused on promoting certain values through that education. So, similar to the YMCA. So, of course, it did a lot of good, but it taught morality and Americanism in the vein of what those in power thought it should be at that time, shaping generations of immigrants to become what certain people saw as moral, saw as healthy, whatever. And physical culture, as well as play, was one of the mechanisms through which this happened. As the Azzarello quote shows, democratic play aimed to provide safe learning spaces, such as playgrounds, that promoted healthy living conditions, women's competitive sports, national identification, and physical educational experiences for the well being of immigrants and poor people. So we see here play and physical culture being used educationally again in these spaces within the city. Similar to, as we talked about, the YMCA and YMHA, which use physical culture in a way to espouse these theological lessons about morality onto young men. But also in the playgrounds in cities at this time, we get this thing called the playground movement. And this corresponded with the push to get people outside, specifically children, but also to structure these playgrounds in a way that aided for development and not just any type of development. So, a lot of people building these playgrounds in which inner city kids played in were inspired by what was called the evolutionary theory of play. And essentially, this was the idea following the logic of social Darwinism that from childhood to adulthood, each person goes through our ancestors' stages of development in one lifetime. Meaning that, so if humanity went from savage when they were first the Neanderthals and eventually over thousands of years became civilized, the evolutionary theory of play said that babies were born like our first ancestors were in that savage state, and as they grow up and go through certain variables and certain environments and certain learning stages of development, they develop into these civilized people. Just like our ancestors did, babies went to adulthood. And so they argued that you needed to have these various measures to aid in that development to make sure that they properly went into the state of civilization that they belonged in. Now, remember, following the ideas of social Darwinism, they didn't believe that everybody went to the same stage of civilization in adulthood. They thought that specifically white men was the most advanced form of civilization, whereas non-whites were still in somewhat of a savage state. Women were in a more complementary role at this time. And so, following this theory of play, they thought that they needed to structure play in ways that would aid people into developing into their appropriate stage of civilization, which meant kind of white men at the top and everybody else in their certain roles. Women playing more secondary private roles, quote unquote inferior races, as people thought at the time, would play more subservient roles, things of that sort. So we see playgrounds and the leaders that are aiding kids play in these playgrounds very much influenced by this evolutionary theory of play and structuring them to make sure that white men were taking on leadership roles, women were taking on less physical roles and more subservient roles, things of that sort. Also, at this time, we get the City Beautiful movement, and this is brought upon by a lot of architects and urban planners who are concerned that the congestion of the city is detracting from the city's image, hurting tourism, and making people unhealthy. And so what they did was they thought that a lot of open spaces and buildings could not only make the city more beautiful, as the name suggests, but also help with health problems. They thought that if they created a lot of natural spaces for people to get outdoors, such as parks, they could be the lungs of the city, make the city more beautiful, make people be less dense and have less congestion, and therefore also cure disease. And so that's what they did. A lot of these reformers, a lot of the middle and upper class, created these parks, um, saying that with the pretense that it was for the lower class people in order to get them outside. However, that's not exactly what happened. A lot of the parks were created in areas that were used for the benefit of the middle and upper class. And there was conflict over how the parks would be used. Whereas when the working class people wanted to use the parks, it was for recreation and a lot of sport and physical culture that upper class people viewed as immoral or inappropriate, things such as football and fighting. And so we get the upper class kind of structuring these parks with these specific rules in order to encourage morality in these parks or have people not use them. And as a result, people eventually started to not use them and they became kind of a tool of the elite who put them in. The Hardy article does a great job of explicating this process. Okay, so we talked about how urbanization shaped sport and sport shaped urbanization. Now let's talk about suburbanization within the context of the same processes. And we'll start after World War II, where we get all these societal changes that change how we understand commercial sport. One of which being the distribution of teams. So this occurred in every major sport at the time, but let's look at Major League Baseball as an example. In the first half of the 20th century, we see the geographical distribution of teams, mostly northeast in the big cities, only in 10 cities. Well, in the 50s, by the end of the decade, we get an expansion, and slowly, over the next 50 years, we see baseball and other sports as an extension start to spread out around the country. And this is a direct result of a few changes. One of them being the rise of the Sun Belt. And a lot of people start to move to the West and the South, particularly because of the ease of transportation. It's no longer you have to take a long train ride or anything. You can fly. You also have air conditioning that makes the West and the South livable, essentially. And so we get a lot of people moving to these new regions that technology is making desirable, with sport following them. Not only sport, but industry followed them. Traditional manufacturing moves from the Rust Belt in the Midwest. A lot of that goes to the Sun Belt. Television is also an emergence that allows sport to spread out. Sport doesn't have to be concentrated with the advent of television because teams don't have to rely on people being able to go to the stadium to see the game and people taking pride only in their team locality. They can now get TV contracts and have people across the nation and in some instances across the world view their games. So they don't specifically rely on just stadium traffic in order to make their money. And like I said, transportation helps this move across the country. In the 1950s, a lot of baseball teams would take trains to their away games, and that was a long trip. So a trip from, say, New York to Chicago in 1950 would take about 16 hours by train. Chicago to San Francisco would take about 40 to 50 hours. So there weren't a lot of games going on that were away. You were basically stuck playing the people that were close to you. But commercial planes, as we know, changed this. Now you could um, go from Chicago to San Francisco in about 3 hours, 4 hours. So it made sport a lot more easy to travel. And in this same era is when we get governments begin to intervene into sport, specifically in their relationship to the city. So, starting to realize some of these benefits that sport brings to cities, governments started to subsidize stadiums that were built because they realized that to have a sport was a profitable endeavor and that you wanted to be a city that had a sport. So instead of just relying and hoping that an entrepreneur would come along or somebody with private capital in order to build a stadium, a lot of local governments would subsidize stadiums with taxpayer money in order to get the teams to come to the city or in a lot of cases stay in the city. Now, this is something that today has become controversial because, as a lot of recent scholars suggest, we know that when taxpayer money is used to subsidize stadiums, um, a lot of the benefit doesn't go back to the taxpayer like people argue it does. It goes to private investors, it goes to the political interests of the city and the politicians who broker the deal. Nonetheless, thinking historically, this kind of changed the game in sports as it gave teams more power to choose where they wanted to play. And this kind of spawned the era of relocation and expansion, and where sports could kind of have more negotiating power, knowing that certain cities would subsidize them. That if a certain city, say, I don't know, Seattle, wasn't giving a team the tax benefits that they wanted or whatever complaints that they had, they could basically hold the city hostage and say, okay, so us Supersonics, we are giving Seattle a benefit, allowing people to have pride, bringing people to games. Give us what we'll want, or we'll pack up and go to, I don't know, say Oklahoma City or something like that. Hypothetically, of course. This is what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers, right? They moved from Brooklyn all the way across the country to Los Angeles, welcome with government subsidy. And so at this time is also the era of suburbanization, where people who came to the city from urbanization start to locate out of the city. And this happens for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is the building of suburbs and the government incentivization of people to move from the city to the suburbs as well.
After spending their lives in cramped walk-ups and crowded subways, what people in post-war Brooklyn wanted was space and homes of their very own. And when Levittown opened on Long Island in the late 40s, they began to get it. Less than 30 miles from Ebbets Field, it was a whole nother world.
Suburbs? Suburbs? When you went to Long Island, you were going to the country.
You know, the good earth. You finally have a piece of land in your own home, and that was the dream of a lot of our parents. And it was sort of the definition of making it.
In the newspaper in the 50s, I remember seeing houses for sale, and the advertisement beckoned people, leave the city on the new superhighway out to Long Island. And hey, people started to leave.
So as that video suggests, this wasn't just a random circumstantial process, it was very intentional. So after World War II, the government began to encourage home ownership. And what they did was provide a lot of VA loans for people coming back from the war that would allow them to buy a house. They created the FHA, which allowed people to have or decreased interest rates for a lot of the people trying to move to the suburbs within certain regions. They created a federal highway system to make it easier to go from the suburb to the city, to allow people that worked in the city to live outside of it and not have to commute for hours on the way. And I should say that this process was not something that happened for everyone. In fact, it was highly racialized. One of the reasons that the city was seen as something to move away from was that too many minorities and too many people with non-white ethnic backgrounds were moving into the city. And due to kind of this conglomeration of racism and reactionary politics, we see this first kind of discourse of um, crime within cities and delinquency and people not getting along, or the idea of it. And because of that, a lot of white people, specifically white people with money, wanted to get out of this space that they're being told by a lot of people is dangerous for white people or is inherently bad because of the people that live in it. Not, the actual structural issues that create poverty, right, such as discrimination, but the fact that by very virtue of these people's background or innate racial characteristics, that they're just these bad people. So we get white flight, as it's called, in suburbanization, and this is encouraged by the government, or at least it's discouraged for non-white people to suburbanize. One of the reasons that the FHA and housing loans were approved with low interest rates that allowed people to buy homes at affordable rates. The only reason that FDR was able to pass that was the promise that they would exclude African Americans from that same legislation to appease the Southern Democrats who essentially didn't want to see racial equality. And so the suburbs become almost exclusively white in the latter half of the 20th century. And it's not just the legislation that does this, but it's kind of a creative ensemble of ways in which this was done. So housing covenants that made people who bought a house in a certain neighborhood sign a contract saying that they wouldn't sell their house to a black person or a Jewish person, not just out of racism, but because of the racism of buyers, that having someone in there would decrease the value of all the other homes in that neighborhood. Redlining, which was the practice of delineating which places would be approved for white people to live and which places would be approved for non-white people to live, which is where we see the ghettos today. Blockbusting, loan discrimination, zoning regulation. I won't get into all of these one by one, but good old-fashioned racial violence when all those other more intricate systemic things didn't work was the way to basically keep the suburbs white. And because of this, because all the money is moving to the suburbs, we get a decline of the urban core. People with money are moving to the suburbs, which means that the cities that are already struggling are losing that tax base, and as a result are going to struggle more, which leads to more struggling, which leads to public services being cut, which leads to more struggling, which leads to, of course, even more discourse, rightful or not, about the city being perceived as this space of danger and decay and pollution and overall demonization.
In altering New York City's landscape, Robert Moses changed the face of Brooklyn. Those mostly white residents who were moving out to the suburbs were being replaced by Puerto Rican immigrants and poorer blacks from the South. In the Dodgers, who fielded 6 black players, among them one Latino, Cuban Sandy Amoros, those new minority residents found a model of integration and a winning team to cheer for. But in those new residents, Walter O'Malley only found more reasons for concern.
He called me into his office one day and said, "Look out the window." I said, "What do you see?" "You see about 600-700 people lined up across the street." He said, that's the unemployment office. He said, look at them. They're blacks and they're Puerto Ricans. They don't pay their way. They don't come to the ballpark. Why are we catering to these people? Don't get me wrong, the Waller wasn't a racist. If you were a minority, they could afford the $5 or $10, fine, he was all for it. But if you couldn't come to the ball game, he wasn't a fan of yours. Waller was all business.
And as the video talks about, sport followed people to the suburbs. And we start to see sport within the suburbs become determined by one's socioeconomic status, class, race, gender, and also patterns in which they lived. And so sporting entrepreneurs who maybe not have gotten what they wanted out of the city would take advantage of the inexpensive land that's popping up in these suburbs, the stable neighborhoods that would incentivize people to go to more games, because a lot of people were resisting going to games in the city because of the image of the city as something of danger and decay, and also the highway access that makes it easier. A lot of teams go from the actual city to the suburbs. That's why we see in a lot of cities stadiums now not being located in the actual cities that they represent, but in the suburbs. We see the New York Giants not even playing in New York, but in New Jersey. We see FedEx Field in Lanham, Maryland. I don't know if that's even how you pronounce it. But you see this going on everywhere, where stadiums and teams are following people to where the money is at. And stadiums that are built downtown are following the trends of gentrification, which we see as kind of as the next phase of after suburbanization, where people in the suburbs taking advantage of this decaying base, which makes city property really cheap because of all the poverty, come back into the city because it's cheap and try to redevelop it. It's controversial. I won't get into all the different things about gentrification, but essentially what it does is allows stadiums to get back that idea of being authentically from the city, that if you're coming to watch a game in the city, you're doing something authentically Washington, D.C. or authentically Chicago. But in the process, a lot of the construction of these stadiums and even the images that they portray when they're on TV are these very selected images that are created to give the city a certain image, designed to kind of erase a lot of the poverty and a lot of the other things that are a result of this declining base and taxpayer subsidization of private capital, such as stadiums, at the expense of public services and things of that sort. So in conclusion, it's worth thinking about the relationship between physical culture and sport, and also, or the city, I mean, and also power, because there's this interesting trifecta that's working here that has allowed cities to very much influence how sport is played, where it is, but also sport to very much influence cities. And we can see how sport itself and cities themselves have been structured by power in the interest of power as well. Thank you.